Great. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be asked. The subject of today's conversation is social capital and thinking about social capital as a context, as a juxtaposition within public relations scholarship can take place. So I've spent a lot of time and many years writing about social capital and public relations. That research has overlapped quite a bit with my research in civil society. Much of that began with working with Maureen. So I'm hoping she'll have some good things to contribute in today's conversation. But raise your hand or do the little hand thingy on Zoom if you've ever heard the following: you and you alone are responsible for your success. Who's heard that phrase before? All right, so Anna's heard that phrase before. Has anybody else heard that phrase before? That you and you alone are responsible for your success. You've got to pick yourself up by your bootstraps, and if you work hard enough, you will achieve what you want to achieve. How much do we believe that sentiment, that statement? Erin, what do you think?
It completely ignores the fact that we're extrinsic factors that affect your success.
Okay, so it acknowledges the fact that there's a lot of external things going on, right? So working hard might be a component of success, but there are other supportive factors around you that contribute to a person's success, right? So what I hope to accomplish today is to overview definitions of social capital, a lot of which paint the picture of these supporting factors that contribute towards an individual's success, an organization's success, and a community's success. What are these things that allow organizations to survive and thrive in their contexts? I'm also going to briefly review approaches to social capital's assessment. It's a very vague and murky concept, so there's differing ways of which to research it and to go about measuring its presence or absence within the community. I hope to ask a lot of questions about to you in terms of how public relations research and public relations articles have considered social capital, and then offer future directions for how we might better consider social capital in our research moving forward. Above all, please let this be a conversation rather than just me talking. It's going to be a very boring lecture if I'm just talking at you. I would much rather be engaged and be challenged in conversation with you over Zoom, as difficult as that might be. All right, so a question for, we might ask our undergraduate public relations students. You need a high quality camera for a public relations project, but you don't have one. What are you going to do? Anybody? Yes,
there are
Anna,
several options. Well, there are several options.
Okay.
First, if you're rich, you can go ahead and buy it, but many times you're not very rich and you don't have money to buy it.
Okay.
So you would go ask your friend or library. In our case, we have great resources in the library.
I'd probably tweet.
Okay, so you could tweet it out asking if somebody's got a high quality camera. You would go to your library, and that presumes, of course, you live in a community that has access to a high quality library, and you can rent that kind of equipment or take it out of the library, or you're enrolled at a university. You've got friends who have a camera or who know someone who have a camera, right? All of these things are describing a certain kind of social capital, right? I live in a place that's got a library. I can take out a camera from that library. I can tweet, and hopefully my network, I can solicit support from someone who will loan me that camera, right? You might have an idea for a new business. Are you going to talk to your network about this idea, and what are you hoping to get from your network about this idea?
Leads, an idea about whether or not there's a market for it.
Okay, is there a market for it? Is there new leads that I have not considered for this business? Is it a viable, a business strategy, right? You're going to recruit different folks from different spheres of business operation to run this idea past, right? You're hopefully not going to launch it alone, right? You're going to draw upon the expertise of varying individuals. And then finally, this is the classic example. If you need a new job, what are you going to do? You're going to turn to your network to ask people if they have any leads. Now, this also brings up the question, though, what kind of contact, what kind of relationship with a person is likely to have the best information on a potential job? Is it going to be your close network, your family, your close friends, or what type of relationship network is going to be best for you to uncover new leads on a job?
I would say it depends on the culture.
Okay.
In some cultures, it is better. It's more likely to find a new job through their not as close contacts. So through the people who are different from you in some way. So, for example, my parents might not have a good job for me, or my best friends might not have a good job for me. But in other cultures where I guess there is maybe less trust. I don't know what's the best. I mean, there are some other cultures that actually put their own people on the jobs next to them. So, for example, in Russia, that's the situation. So, if a person got into somewhere, this person will try to bring other people, next to work along. So, I would say it would depend on the culture.
Yeah, and you're speaking to something I'm going to talk to later on, is that there are different kinds and ways to view social capital. You can get a new job through what's called your weak ties, people who are not necessarily like you, who are going to have information out there about potential possibilities that maybe your closest friends and family don't have. On the other hand, what Anna just described is, I might get a job with friends and family because I am their friends and family, and they're only going to hire people because I'm like them. And so two different kinds of network approaches to social capital, what's called network closure, right? Or the sort of weak ties approach to social capital. I'm going to spread my ties cast my information request out to my weakest ties, or I'm going to rely on my closest network of support. So this speaks to the flexibility of the concept of social capital, but also a definitional weakness. One of the critiques of the concepts we use in public relations is that, we bend them a lot. This idea of symmetrical communication has been very flexible in its application in research. So either something is symmetrical or it's not, or either something is social capital or it's not. So it's a murky concept, and that's one of the weaknesses of the approach. So a premise for discussion, hi Kim. A premise for discussion is that the actions we take and their success are in large part enabled and shaped by the resources we invoke in our network. What do we make of that premise? I'm very comfortable sitting in silence, just like I am in my undergraduate classes. The actions that we take and their success or lack thereof are in large part enabled and shaped by the resources we invoke in our network.
When we say invoke, do we mean put, kind of insert?
That we invoke, that we call upon, enact, that we draw upon. Yeah.
I think absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Erin.
Aside from anything else, when people contribute to your project or to those actions, they're invested in them, and so they then have interest in you succeeding. So I think that the more people you bring on board to support your actions, the more likely they are to succeed.
Yeah, and if you invoke that resource from your contact, right, they become invested in you, which means actually they've got a stake in hoping that you're going to reciprocate at some point, right? So we build social capital, we invoke these resources in the hope that you're going to give a resource back in return, right? That speaks to a very important component of social capital, is that if reciprocity is there, we can call that social capital. If no reciprocity exists, or the potentiality of invoking future resources, we can't necessarily call it social capital because there's no assumed reciprocity there. So that does speak to the varying definitions that we have of social capital in the literature. This is a concept that's emerged from varying disciplines. So a certain kind of capital that can create advantages for individuals or groups pursuing their own ends. So that presumes that there are differing kinds of capital, not just social capital. Investment of resources with expected returns in the marketplace. marketplace of ideas, marketplace of relationships. I put things out there in the expectations I'm going to get something back. And then finally, all those resources that an actor can mobilize and or profit from because of his or her embeddedness in a network of relations with other actors. So these definitions can be conflicting, but they do have certain things in common. We talk about marketplace, we talk about resources as different kinds of capital. This necessarily raises the notion of financial capital as well. But is financial capital equivalent to social capital in any sense? Kim, what do you think?
I think it's a familiar concept for people to be able to conceptualize what capital means, but I think financial capital is very, it's almost too simple because it is one form, whereas social capital is very complex because it can be enacted in a number of forms, or it can be, you know, the outcome can be a number of different things. I don't know if that.
So it's different in how it's enacted, and the outcomes are different. So it speaks to social capital as both a precondition, a process, and an outcome, which is, again, the problems with its operationalization. It's very vague. But financial capital, as you say, is a distinct concept, and many people believe that social capital is often a necessary precondition for financial capital. Go ahead, sir.
Metaphorically, though, I mean, in practice, financial capital is largely used to exploit and to achieve your own goals. And social capital is actually just the opposite. If you use social capital to exploit people and to use them to get what you want, you're going to lose social capital. Whereas with financial capital, often it's just the opposite. We use it, we take advantage of people, and we're able to keep doing that because we have the capital. And so I think they're completely different in terms of their practice.
Yeah. But very often in entrepreneurship research, we see that people often have to utilize and draw upon their social capital networks to gain investors, right? To build support for a business. So people drawing on their social capital networks and having a rich stock of social capital is often necessary for building up financial capital. So they are discrete concepts for sure. But they are, they measure different things, and metaphorically, as Michael says, speak to different ends, but they can be used together. The ability to yes, please.
Sorry, I just have a question. Can there be such a thing as too many resources? Because if we think of social capital in terms of the information as well, like several layers of social capital, I feel like sometimes when there's too much information, you get overwhelmed and it's not really helping you out. So kind of thinking critically, is there such a thing as too many resources? And maybe when you have too many resources, you also have to commit to too many things, and it's kind of, you know, it's you got empty too easily, I guess.
Yeah.
What do you think?
So I don't think the social capital literature is necessarily considered something as having too many resources, because we preconceive social capital as just having the ability to access a resource when I need it, right? So I can get the resources I want, I can get the kinds of information and support I want when I need it. So very often, and it depends on which theorist point of view you're drawing on, it's not actually getting something, it's just the potential to access something when I need it. So if, you know, if I've got a wealth of information out there that might just be, you know, a mind dump of information, that might necessarily be helpful. But if I know someone who can get the right information for me, that's a source of social capital right there. We talk about public relations as needing information curators, right? And people who can handle a great amount of information and distill it into usable content and usable insight for strategy, right? That's a certain kind of social capital if we've got contact with those kind of individuals. The esteemed Dr. Taylor, did you have something that you wanted to add?
One, I would mention that in networks, that's one of the reasons having too many people that you interact with, that you have relationships with, can be a problem, because it takes so much relational time to maintain those strong and weak ties. That's why the concept of structural whole is really valuable, that you can maintain relationships through others, and you can still be engaged and still gain information, but you don't have to engage in that deep relationship or even that weak relationship. So
Yeah.
Because as somebody who's now developed a really large network, it becomes at times really hard to manage all of the relationships that you have. You still want to maintain that social capital, you still want to maintain all those relationships, but sometimes you have to do it through a third person, and that would be your structural whole.
Yeah. So
on that, sorry, isn't there also research that suggests dormant ties are still part of your network, and that you can reactivate dormant ties, and people with whom you have dormant ties are still likely to have more of an interest in your success?
Sure. So dormant ties are often conceived of as a form of weak tie that can be reactivated should you need it, right? So again, that is one way to look at social capital, not as active participation in a network, right? But the ability to call upon that resource if it's required. And that is also assumed then that there is sort of a mutuality and reciprocation that is going to be there. And so that does speak to something that Maureen just brought up, that if you are feeling overburdened by the amount of relationships that you must maintain, but you're not really getting things back, that perhaps is not it's not social capital, it's not an advantage, right? We have theories of communication that say we weigh the costs and benefits of engaging in relationships, yes? So we're not going to engage in relationships that cost too much but yield very little. So that is a concept that speaks very close to the social capital literature. Moving on to sort of an organizational perspective, the ability to cultivate mutually supportive relationships is essential to organizational success. Will we generally agree with this premise? I think the last 30 years of public relations scholarship would sort of support this assertion. Or have we relied too much on this notion of building mutually supportive relationships as equating to organizational success?
So my view on that is an organization can't exist without relationships. But the relationships are actually people. So yes, the people who work in the organization have to cultivate relationships or supportive relationships. So my view is that I tend to agree with that, but it's open for debate.
Anyone else have a viewpoint on this? I would agree with what Petra just stated, and scholars like Oyvind Eklund have gone so far to say that organizational relationship building is akin to the building of organizational social capital, and that's the context in which we should be positioning organizational relationship building, that it has positive outcomes not only for those with whom we build relationships, but for the organization's success. It speaks to things we teach in undergraduate classes about community relationships and building reservoirs of goodwill. These are all forms of social capital from which we can draw on down the road. So social capital is murky because it is connected with all these varying different concepts: corporate social responsibility, advocacy, other areas of public relations scholarship I'll mention later, because it's been developed within political science, development communication, public administration, sociology, and most recently in public relations. We've started tackling the notion of social capital really with only the last 15 years, and we have in large respect Maureen to thank for introducing the concept of the discipline, and it's become particularly prevalent in network approaches to public relations. So what's the difference between a normative and a positive theory? Michael, you want to speak to this one?
Sure, I know this one. Normative theories are what we should be doing, and positive theories are what we actually are doing.
Okay, so is social capital a normative or a positive theory? Or does it even qualify as a theory?
I don't know. I think it's, well, I mean, we could argue it's a little of both, that we build networks to have better ties and stronger networks, but at the same time, we build networks and stronger ties to have bigger networks, which gives us more power and lets us do more things. So you could put it in either camp, I think.
Okay. So we also agree that we've got different kinds of different strata of theory in public relations, right? We might have individual level theories, organizational level theories, then societal level theories. So Michael, which level is social capital at? Is it an individual, organizational, or societal theory?
I mean, all, but I've got Maureen here helping me. I think we can argue all.
But why all? I mean, can a theory be all? That kind of makes it not particularly precise or useful, or, I mean, can it really be all?
No, I mean, I have a piece recently that I've been working on, I think a revise and resubmit, but we're arguing, in many ways, many of our theories we take for granted, like excellence theory is both a normative and a positive theory. It's not simply a feature, one or the other. And lots of theories are both normative and positive, especially in our field where what we do is largely about practice. And so we have theories. So, dialogue says this is what you should do, which is a normative theory. But at the same time, genuine dialogue is describing a practice of what we've done, of what people must do for it to happen. So the theory can be both.
So theory can be both, right? It becomes tricky, however, then how to operationalize this theory for its greatest theoretic and heuristic utility, right? And how we're actually going to implement that in practice if it's both normative, positive, individual, organizational, and societal, right? So this again speaks to this overall murkiness and difficult in conceptualization and practice. So there's several complementary and sometimes even conflicting theories of social capital. What I think they all share and has greatest relevance for public relations is this notion of resources embedded in your relationships. According to Robert Putnam, social capital is the collective value of all of your social networks. And resources can look like many different things. As Anna pointed out, information can be a resource. Perhaps too much of it is, can be a detriment. Access to certain kinds of people is a resource. The ability to broker resources yourself and information, that's a resource. And things like social support, people who are there for you, willing to help you get things done, is a resource. There are lots of other ways we could take a look at what resources mean for social capital. So there are many prominent social capital theorists, but I'm going to talk about two of the most popular ones, that is Robert Putnam and Pierre Bordeaux. Robert Putnam really hit at the heart of his theory of social capital is the notion of repeated social contexts. These contexts have to be really repeated and frequent in order for them to be called social capital. So he might not, Aaron, be totally on board with this idea of dormant ties. But he also emphasizes this notion, okay, for it to be social capital, we've got to have common goals in mind. We don't have common goals and norms. It's going to be really hard for us to work together and produce individual and group outcomes. He also talks about the nature of networks and how important network structure is, the size of your network, and network density as important to social capital. So Anna, you brought up the point earlier about network centralization, right? So what do you think in terms of network density? Is a really dense network good for social capital, or is a more weakly structured network good for social capital?
If I'm not mistaken, a weakly structured network is better for social capital because of the weak ties. But I guess you need to have a little bit of both. So it cannot be too loose, and it should not be too dense. So there should be something in middle ground between the strong ties you have and the weak ties you have.
Yeah. You speak again to this conflict in the social capital literature. Some people would say, yeah, a weakly structured network is best, but not too weak. So you can access those weak ties. Other folks would say, you reap certain kind of benefits from being in the middle of a very dense network, right? I have a lot of close ties around me that are going to support me. That provides a different kind of social capital than something I might get from a weak tie out there. He also emphasizes the quality of the relationships, and this is where Putnam really overlaps with public relations research and their notions of OPRs, trust, mutuality, satisfaction, these variables. So how much the quality of relationship is there. He talks about social capital as outcome-oriented, being used for things, whereas other scholars have talked about just the access to this network, being surrounded by important people. So 4 features, he says, are really important for social capital. That social networks have value beyond just your companionship and emotional connection. That you get information from those ties, like jobs, investments. That you're going to get a reciprocity or a mutual aid. You're going to engage in collective action together, and finally provides a sense of identity and solidarity. All of these things help to create this vague notion of social capital around you. The one that he, which one of these do you think he comments is most important? Information, reciprocity, collective action, or identity and solidarity? Chima, I haven't caught that
Reciprocity?
yet.
Sorry.
My research is on collective action, so I think collective action is very important for democracy.
Yes, collective action is very important for democracy, but in order to have collective action, we have to assume to a certain extent that a reciprocity is going to occur, right? And that if there's no reciprocity in those relationships, we're not going to engage in collective actions together. So he actually speaks to reciprocity as being one of the most important features. Are we connected now more than ever? All right, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, but all of us have 2, 3, 4 Zoom meetings every day, if not more, right? We're on Facebook and Twitter all the time, or Weibo or whatever, TikTok. Are we more connected now than ever? Alvin, what do you think?
I mean, in terms of number of ties, then probably like 100%, because now we have different kinds of weak ties that you still build through online relationships with, for example, your colleagues from a previous institution, or friends from college, from high school. You're still maintaining that relationship through social media, for example. But I think for the close ties, more or less the same. I don't know, just a guess.
So Putnam would say that we're actually way down in our strong times. Hello, Kitty. He would say we've far dropped in our strong ties, but he actually has not yet addressed this quality of interaction via social media and whether or not that provides weak ties. But Putnam actually says that joining groups and being a part of a group is the #1 predictor of high social capital. He points to figures that says joining in one group cuts in half your odds of dying in the next year, right? So just being a member in one social group, every 10 minutes of commuting reduces all forms of social capital by 10%. I can talk about some of his measurement later. And watching TV, he actually attributes television to the downfall of Western civilization, where every hour of watching commercial television is associated with lower social capital. We're not joining groups anymore. So he actually calls this feature bowling alone. You've heard of the phrase bowling alone before? He coined this phrase, right? So we've seen a significant drop in club meetings, even though that's an antiquated form of association. I mean, who is a member of the Elk or the Moose clubs anymore, right? We see drops in family dinners. We see significant drops in friends coming over. So what does all this lack of personal engagement result in, do you think? Michael, go ahead.
Well, but I was going to say, but this is from 2000. And I think there's an argument to be made that things are vastly different now than they were then. I'm not sure I disagree that, like, I actually think if we went bowling, it'd probably be better for our health, mental and physical. But people are, I think, connected hugely. I mean, the average Facebook network is 500 people, and those are 95% loose tie, weak ties. And so people have connections that they never had before 20 years ago.
But I also want to say that the algorithms, they change the way we interact. So even though we have thousands and thousands of people that we are connected to, we really see the news only from very few lucky ones. You know what I mean? So I don't know. Like, I don't know whether we are more connected. I don't think I have a very strong opinion on which way, on whether we have more social capital, less social capital. I don't think I can answer this question at this point, but I'm thinking about it.
Well, but if you joined the Moose Lodge 25 years ago, you would have people who were business people, and you'd have people who were, unemployed. You'd have people who were laborers, and you'd have people who were Republicans and Democrats, from different parties. And now, as you said, because of the algorithms, they bring us content that fits our worldview, and they limit our exposure to competing views. And we just block people who don't like what they have to say. And so that also has had an impact.
May I just drop in something, just answering to Eric's question on what does this lack of personal engagement result in? I would say that it resulted in less responsibilities for reciprocity, because it's one thing to talk to a person face to face, and it's completely another thing to talk to a person online on social media. You may not notice an email, you may not notice the message, but face to face is a completely different thing. So I would say maybe in this way it's affecting social capital.
So,
but I think
please go ahead.
Kind of reductive to do it as either or. Like, a lot of my online relationships become offline relationships. And if I'm thinking about it in terms of my capacity to access resources, through social media, I have vastly more resources that I can access, whether it's to people of influence or actual physical resources, than I would have 5 years ago by a really significant measure.
So having access to resources, different kinds of people, speaking to tolerance of different opinions, as Anna pointed out, and Michael pointed out, this intimately connects to the notion of social capital. So social capital, as I'll discuss later, is connected to some pretty big meta-societal theories like public sphere civil society theories, and connected to the health and robustness of a democracy. As Putnam says, social capital makes us smarter, healthier, safer, richer, and better able to govern a just and stable democracy. What connection is there between tolerating a difference in opinion from somebody else in conversation? How does that scale up to having a stronger, more stable democracy? Can we make a link between something like that? Petra?
Well, actually, I was going to ask a question a little bit earlier, and I was going to ask, does it mean when we are more connected that we necessarily have more social capital? I mean, we talk about having big networks, but then we talk about the difficulties maintaining these big networks. So I'm wondering if the two actually, are directly related to each other. The other question that I had is, I was looking at this, so commuting 10 minutes drops your social capital by 10%. I was thinking, that pretty much drops my social capital by 50%, given the fact that I commute pretty far into work. But my connections to my colleagues are actually pretty strong. And I would think that there's a lot of social capital going on. So I don't know that I have an answer to that. I'm just wondering whether sometimes when we theorize that it actually really works out in practice. So no real answer there.
I guess it would depend on how Putnam is conceiving of social capital, what relevance that has to your personal existence, right? And are we actually measuring social capital in terms of joining antiquated forms of socialization, right? Out clubs, moo clubs, all these sorts of things, right? Or are we taking a look at new network forms of association and gathering and ways of forming relationships with colleagues it speaks to, again, the differing views of what social capital is, right? Is it membership in the groups and the resources that we get from those kind of group associational life, which is very much aligned with civil society research, this notion of the L clubs, the mood clubs, the NGOs, all these sorts of things that form a robust civil society? Or are we seeing a new form of civil society interaction through digital communication? Anna, please.
Yes, I'm just, as you speak, I'm sorry, Petra. As you speak, I was just thinking that, I was actually thinking of your idea last meeting of ours when you spoke about cutting the relationships that is functional, ending the relationships. And there was an idea that I kind of wasn't sure about. But I mean, the idea that you need to end bad relationships. And as I thought about this, I was thinking that, okay, network is good, connection is good. But if you're connected to bad people, it's not good for you. So it doesn't mean you have good social capital. Or if you are, if in your network, there are only like conspiracy people, then it's not helping you either. So it's not, I guess it's not only about, even if you can trust them and they're very good and they're going to help you to find a job or anything, but the content that is going through those networks is actually not very helpful, or not, I mean, do you see what I mean?
Well, can I just add to that? When you were saying that, Anna, I was thinking to myself, okay, so we talk about good and bad social capital, but what if I'm a gang member and I have very strong connections to other gang members? You may not see it as good social capital, but for me, it's pretty good social capital. Yeah, exactly, Michael. So, I get benefits from that. So I'm thinking to myself, is maybe like sometimes when we look at theorists, is it formed from a specific perspective, or maybe an idealized perspective of what society should look like?
Yeah. I guess what I want to add, and it's not exactly what I meant. I mean, yes, that's one of the ways that even if you're connected to bad people, it still can be good for you. But what I meant is that you can actually be connected to, I don't want to say bad people, to other people, but those people are not really helping you, or they're using you, or they're exploiting you. So even though you trust them and you're well connected, you don't have this social capital. I guess that's because you don't have reciprocity, you know what I mean? So it's not, maybe we shouldn't look at social capital from the individual point of view, but maybe we should look at like broadly. I don't know.
If we go back to the metaphor though, like Eric, I think asked, is it social capital better than financial capital? If you think about financial capital, having a lot of money can be good and bad. There are, I think in practice, most people with a lot of money are bad, but having a lot of money gives you the ability to do things you couldn't otherwise do, and you can help people with that. I don't know if that holds for social capital, because we could argue that having a big network gives you a lot of ability to influence people. But as we just said, if your network is bad, if you're a gangster or a gang member or something else, then that power that you get from the social network can be abused really easily. So, I don't know if there's an answer to it. I mean, clearly it depends. The answer is depends.
Isn't it also a reflection of the motivation or intention behind being part of that group? So, you talk about antiquated groups. An antiquated group is a group that no longer serves a purpose for you. So, for example, if you don't want to be part of that gang, you'll always have those connections. But if it no longer serves you as a resource, whatever that resource is, then you form different groups. So, the whole intention and motivation behind being part of that group, I think, is really the driver and the indicator of how much capital you draw or potentially can draw from that group, or that exists within that group.
Mm-hmm. This debate speaks to this notion of social capital as network closure or the weakly structured network. The weakly structured network is the one that is more closely associated with building larger collective trust in democratic societies, whereas a network closure can reinforce sometimes damaging norms that are shared and results in groupthink and a mentality that perpetuates negative behavior and abuse of power, such as in gangs. The Nazi Party had great social capital, right? So, you know, they could call on resources. They recreated very damaging and evil norms that sustain their operation, right? So that the form of network closure can result in abuse of power and ideology in that way. Moving on, I want to discuss this, our second important theorist, who actually, let's speak to this debate about network closure, and that's Pierre Bordeaux. He's much more interested in this notion of network closure than Robert Putnam. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, just my thing said Alvin had his hand up. Did you want to jump in with something, Alvin?
Oh, I didn't see that.
Oh yeah, I was talking about. I was thinking about the last slide about should we think about social capital in a individual level or a societal level. I think from the PR perspective that we think about PR as a driving force to create social capital among the society. I think it's better to understand social capital through at least a community level, at a societal level. So when we are analyzing how social capital can change things, I don't think focusing on an individual, a gang member, will be beneficial. I think it's better to understand the whole net, because we are talking about network. Network is more than single nodes. We are talking about the holistic view of the whole network relationship networks. So I think a lot of studies on social capital, for example, in political science, and right now, some studies we are seeing about COVID-19, how social capital can predict the number of cases. I think they're all on a collective level instead of on an individual level. And I think it's maybe easier and also more intuitive to apply social capital, the concept, into on a societal level instead of individual level. That's my.
Well, I agree, definitely. I've published several articles on understanding public relations and its impact at the organizational level and at the societal level. But as I do see significant potential, as Petra pointed out, is that relationships are cultivated and built by people, right? So there is application and potential for social capital research at the individual level to understand it, because organizations, their relationships are structured by people. And we understand OPR to be sort of a Western and limited construct, that in many places frameworks like the personal influence model that Schrammich made famous, right, is much more applicable. So understanding public relations as it is enacted at the individual level can be very fruitful for understanding social capital research as it goes forward. Please go ahead. Someone else had a question.
I'm Bhupesh. I'm a PhD student at UNSW, and I'm looking at the role of public relations in international development. Now, I read your paper on social capital and civil society, and you explain how this concept can be used to build, democracy and civil society. And you mentioned that it can be enacted by people and communities at the bottom. This aspect is very important for me, because I'm looking at at community issues, and I'm also trying to explore the role of public relations in community situations. Can you elaborate more on that? I mean, this is very interesting for me.
Yes, that's something I'm going to speak to throughout the lecture, is that social capital and collective trust is less dependent on how government institutions behave and more dependent on how people behave, right? How people behave towards each other have ripple effects for how organizations and institutions are going to be built. And if there's anything we've learned from 50 plus years in the development communication literature, is that top-down initiatives are doomed to failure in perpetuating Western norms and dominance of and colonialist interests in developing nations, whereas collective and bottom-up approaches are more likely to empower and build trust, particularly in societies where trust is lacking. That's something I'm going to speak to a great deal on later in the lecture. But for right now, when I discuss more about Mr. Bordeaux, again, he speaks to the notion of resources in durable networks but it's more with him about the potential to access resources. He focuses very much on the wealthy elite in France and how they maintain power and exclusivity and access just by building relationships with people of like socioeconomic status, and actually kept the rich and powerful, which is a common theme we're seeing in many nations around the world. So this is a question I have for you all. Do you manage access to your social networks, and to what end? This also has implications for public relations, organizational relationship building. Do you manage access to your personal networks, and to what end? Kim, what do you think?
No, I don't. Well,
okay.
No, well, I don't really put a lot of effort into my social networks. No, that's not true. I don't have an answer to that. I do manage my social networks around professional outcomes, or to align with professional academic outcomes, not for personal outcomes. I don't know. I can't answer that question.
So no one in this group has friendship networks that they keep for certain social and personal development needs. Like, I've got this group of friends for this kind of entertainment gratification. I have this friend or these groups of friends that are important for my intellectual stimulation and development. I have this group of friends that are very important for me when I'm down and I need emotional uplift. Does that sound familiar to anyone?
I 100% do that.
Okay, right.
That sounds familiar, yeah.
I have no personal life, so I'm going to be quiet now.
Well, with the international students, Chinese students in particular, who use WeChat, I have to tell them that I have a WeChat network you can join, but that WeChat is not for work. Like, if you start emailing me about problems in class on WeChat, I'm going to block you. WeChat is not for us to do schoolwork. And so I create that. And the same thing is true of other networks. Like, initially with LinkedIn, I was for probably 3 or 4 years, if I didn't know you, I didn't add you to my LinkedIn network. I've given up with LinkedIn and just said, as long as you look like you're not a serial killer, I'm happy to add you to LinkedIn. But for other things, I have a very small Facebook network comparatively, and I don't add people but I would say it all depends. As Kim said, and others, there was a kid I let join my Facebook network once, fairly young kid, and he was posting all these issues about how he was having problems and people were being mean to him. And I said, just dump those people, block them. Like, why can't? What's the problem with that? And as Alvin suggested, the younger people have these networks of friends that go back to when they were in grade school. And for me, getting out of high school was the greatest thing that ever happened. I didn't have to see any of those assholes again the rest of my life. But there are millions of people who are connected with those assholes their whole life, and they don't see it as something they can unfriend them or block them or get rid of them. So I think there's multiple answers to that question, but I think there's many who make no effort to manage their social networks, and many.
I think it's really interesting, how some of the newer tools actually facilitate you doing that. So like Instagram, I've got like 6 or 7 different Instagram accounts that relate to different parts of my life. I've got a baking Instagram and I've got a makeup Instagram. And I think that a lot of new tools actually allow you to compartmentalize people and play that active role in managing your relationships.
Yeah. So all of these examples really speak to Pierre Bordeaux's view of social capital, and that we maintain these networks for certain purposes and for certain resources. And in some ways, it actually aligns with traditional mass communications theories like uses and gratifications theory. We use different channels to meet different gratifications. Well, this view of social capital suggests that we maintain different networks and different kind of relationships to gain access to certain kinds of resource potentialities. So organizations do very much the same thing. It's aligned with resource dependency perspectives, which of course stem from the larger systems theory approaches. We want to build interdependencies with our environment, reducing dependencies on others to gain power for the organization. And we cultivate different kinds of relationships for different ends.
Can I just ask a question, Eric?
Yes.
Just on that, resources to maintain those relationships and those networks are not finite. They're constrained by the boundaries or what's in your system or what's available. So what Erin was talking about, that she's got all of these different Instagram accounts. So by managing all of those accounts, that will be I'm thinking a deficit on the quality or the strength of one network against another network. I don't know. Can you talk to that?
That speaks to whether we view the tie as strong or weak, right? The frequency and intensity of communication, right? I'm going to spend a lot of time and energy building strong ties with those folks whom I get an intense emotional bond and social support from, whereas I can classify weak ties as those from whom I don't need immediate resources or immediate support, but that I know that I can call upon should be necessary, or as Maureen talked about earlier, I cultivate relationships with people whom can put me into touch with those that I might need down the road, right? So a balance of maintaining a network size that is manageable, but still gives you access to broader parts of a network is how network theorists have idealized appropriate levels of social capital, right? So how many strong ties do I maintain versus how many weak ties do I have within my network? This leads to a discussion of different kinds of network approaches to social capital: bonding, bridging, and linking. We've come across this theme several times now in this discussion. Bonding social capital is that dense network that we are surrounding ourselves with people who are like us and have quite a few strong ties with people whom are same socioeconomic background, religious background, ethnic background, and we get a lot of support and structure from that. It's very comfortable to be in that kind of network, and that is a form of social capital. They will give us a job. They will, give food for us should we need it, right? But then there's also bridging social capital, in which I build relationships with people who are different from me. Perhaps the most famous article on this subject is from Granovetter in 1972 called The Strength of Weak Ties, right? We gain a lot of information and novel kinds of information from weak ties. Why is someone at work always in the know? There's always that one person at work who seems to know everything. We call her Betty at the water cooler, right? And so Betty knows everything at the water cooler because Betty has contacts in various different kinds of the parts of the organization, so she gets all that information first. If you consistently surround yourself with people who are like you and are in your circle, are you likely to gain access to new and novel information very quickly? No, that's not the best way to gain access to new and novel information, but it is, again, very comforting and provides a kind of support. You can also link people, and that is a form of social capital. Maureen spoke to this notion of structural holes in network, that if you sit in a position within a network where you're situated between two groups of unconnected people, you get a lot of power in that position where you can broker relationships between disconnected groups of people. So you get information from them, but you can also put together disconnected groups of people. This sort of marks a transition in our discussion this evening from definitions of social capital to how we position social capital theory in larger organizational and societal approaches to public relations. So I just want to throw out a question there for everyone to consider. What makes a place a good place in which to live? So Petra, what makes New Zealand a good place in which to live?
I knew you would pick on me because you're just feeling a little resentful that you couldn't come to the South Island.
She's got Jacinta.
Yeah. I guess what makes a place a good place to live is community, a sense of community. So I was listening at your bonding and your bridging, and I can see from a professional point of view, the linking and the bridging are quite useful. But from a personal point of view, I think strong bonds, a network of people who are actually quite close to you and supportive is quite important to me. And,
okay.
you know, when you talk about, earlier we talked about the collective action, and I mean, if you want to look at COVID-19, that's why New Zealand probably managed to get it under control, because it was a collective action. It wasn't a singular action of one person that instructed people to act. I mean, she did. I mean, as Kim said, we have got Jacinda, that's true. But, you know, she didn't make that decision by herself either. She actually consulted, she talked to people, and she came to that conclusion. But it's a collective action. It's the network, the community of people working together that makes a place good to live. I mean, I can go and live in the mountains by myself. It's all good. It's probably a nice place to live, but you don't have people around you. Previously, we talked about relationships as well, and we said the cultural differences between relationships. And New Zealand is a little bit, it's Western, but it's not quite Western. So the relationships are really part of the community because there's 2 degrees of separation. Someone is related to someone else, someone knows someone else. So you've got to be really careful how you speak as well. I mean, Michael was talking about, yeah, just end a relationship. You can't actually do that in New Zealand. You can try, but guaranteed you're going to run into someone that is related to the person that you've ended the relationship with. So I don't know if I answered your question, Eric, but yeah, a good place for me to live is one with community.
So yes, you speak to a really foundational idea of social capital, is that there is community there. And what makes up a community? People who support one another, right? People who will listen to differing points of view, right? People who are willing to engage in collective actions with each other. People who are willing to trust one another, right? And by many metrics, New Zealand is actually one of the nations on earth that has the highest level of societal social capital, right? So you meet all those high bars that we set for idealized social capital. Is there anything else that we think makes a place a good place in which to live? Michael, you've lived a lot of places. What has made a place a good place in which to live?
Well, you know, there are all those reports, you know, the best places to live in the world, and they're based on things like, you know, financials and the nature of the community and the quality, you know, the community and what people are like. But, you know, I think, as Petra said, I think a lot of it too is a personal thing that I think probably most people don't have a choice and don't make the choice. I'm here in Australia now, and so I've made some choice about where to go and what to do. But you know, there are people who like living up in the mountains and not seeing people, and for them that's the greatest way to live. And then there are people who really want to have a lot of people around, and that's also the greatest thing. So part of it is, I think, a personal thing, and then, you know, there's other things, financial choices and resources and everything else.
One thing that Petra did bring up, and that you sort of touched on, Michael, is that this notion of social capital is a Western individualistic idea, and that we are willing to be a part of a community with differing points of view and trust people who are different from us, right? And that is not a common phenomenon across all places in the world, right? So we see high levels of trust in New Zealand, with other places we don't have high levels of trust, and that's probably a consequence of where you were born, right? We can learn to build trust over time, but if you were born into a society with low levels of trust, right, that's going to be a very hard thing to overcome. So we see what you just spoke to, Petra, this notion of what makes a place a good place in which to live. Oh, your neighbors keep an eye on your house for you. You have a social distancing group of friends right now in COVID-19 times with people who you trust, with having to ask where they've been, right? There's a trust there. You can build relationships with them. Supportive exchanges, you know, you can count on people. These are sort of things that stem from this larger idea of being a part of a community, right? That makes a good place in which to live. We can build communities and we can build our networks through strong or weak ties, through ties that we feel close to that build social support and solidarity. However, that could result in redundant information isolation. Or we can build a community with a larger range of people. We don't feel particularly close to them all the time, but we're going to get fresh information, diverse perspectives, and cognitive flexibility This, however, requires a willingness to engage and a trust in others, maintaining these weak ties. Without a trust in others, we're never going to have many weak ties. We're only going to engage in strong tie building, right? Weak ties are not everything, however. Not everyone is going to be a bridging weak tie, and often there's a little incentive to help someone. That again presumes the fact that we are living in a society where reciprocity is privileged and we're living in a place where we can trust one another. So as we've discussed throughout this evening, social capital has got multiple levels: individual or micro perspectives, organizational, meso or societal or macro perspectives. Vague definitions: we've got support, information exchange, reciprocity, connectedness, social trust and trusted institutions, right? Satisfaction with relationships, numbers of group joins, numbers of nonprofits per capita, election turnout, social tolerance. We've got measures all over the place, right? We've got individual level measures like support, reciprocity, trust. We've got organizational levels of measures like how many groups joined. We've got societal level measures like election turnout and social tolerance, right? So, you know, these instruments are all over the place depending on which focal area of social capital you're going to be looking at. So really, it can be distilled down into three areas of measurement, much aligned with this notion of individual, organizational, or societal. We have structural approaches to measuring social capital, looking at network size, network density, levels of civil engagement. Your trust in institutions is really structural. We have relational approaches to understanding social capital, how cohesive you do your social environment to be in your social networks. And then finally, we've got cognitive approaches to understanding social capital, how we assess shared norms and values and trust interpersonally in other people. So three major categories of measures in social capital. So here is what this whole constellation of ideas might look like in constructing this very meta concept of social capital. Things like diverse views of opinions, sense of belonging, building trust, reciprocity, and actually engaging in groups, participating in society. Social capital is very often equated with perspectives on civil society and the public sphere, and basically are foundations of Western democratic theory. To be a citizen means you participate, right, in things. I'm not going to participate if I don't trust people, if I can't expect them to reciprocate, right, if I am not willing to engage in tolerance of different opinions. So this is a very meta-level concept that speaks to other major areas of scholarship in Western democratic theory. So, is Maureen still around, or did she take off? I would love to hear her answer to this premise. Public relations' role in society is to create and recreate the conditions that enact civil society. So this is the premise that perhaps we can debate in the absence of great Dr. Taylor. What do we think? Hi, Anne, you're there.
I'll get her.
I might be lurking.
Might be lurking. What do you think about this premise of Dr. Taylor's?
Sure, I'm just going to try turning the video on. It wasn't working earlier, but oh, it is. That's fabulous. It's really quite fascinating to me, this bit, given the fact that public relations was really generated out of this whole organizational function, that it's now taken on this societal level role as almost the guardian of fully functioning democratic society. I'm not sure that we are ready for that or prepared for that in any way. I can see that this is aspirational. This is something that it would be great if we did do. But is it really the role of an organizational lackey, and I am, yes, being devil's advocate here, to assume this role in society where, you know, are we really leveling the playing field? Are we really doing this fabulously democratizing thing? Or are we maybe trying to give ourselves a veneer of respectability and legitimacy that might not actually apply? Uh-oh, having said all that, there's Maureen in the background. Now I'm going to turn my camera off and blush fiercely.
Well, remember that the key term here in this is the conditions, right? So conditions mean free flow of information, facts, things that we don't have anymore, right? Give and take, public advocacy, corporate advocacy. So it's the conditions. So our task is to create the conditions that facilitate all of those things: relationship building, information sharing, joint and consensus building, decision making. That's the key term in there, is the conditions.
So a civil society in which is a place in which organizations are allowed to pursue their own ends, right? It's an inherently individualistic concept, and we engage in participation in society in the effort to make our own particular universal, as Hegel would say, right? We're in that constant struggle to engage in debate with others. We want our well-reasoned viewpoint to win out. This draws upon classical skills of public relations and persuasion to convince everyone that our organization is in the right. That's a part of being in a civil society, right? Whether or not the organization is using their resources toward malfeasant ends, that's a different question. But facilitating the conditions in which people can engage in discussion and have their voice heard is part of making a civil society. This is, again, a normative idea. Yes, Anna, please.
No, I agree with this premise. Dr. Taylor, I agree. Now, as I was thinking about it, I was just like, not like questioning, but I was analyzing the saying, how it is said. I feel what I'm confused at and what I'm questioning is, what do we mean by public relations? Because when we say public relations role, are we talking about the function of public relations, or how exactly are we defining public relations? Because who pays for public relations? You know, it's still attached to either non-profit or an organization, or, you know, there are some people, you know, who are just good at communicating and strategically thinking about how they communicate, and, you know, like celebrities and politicians. So I guess I want to, and somewhere in the bottom of my heart, I feel that yes, we do create those conditions, but is it for the public relations per se, or if there is something behind that is using public relations to create those conditions? It's not public relations per se, but it's something else. And as I'm thinking of this, I don't know what it is.
Yeah. One of the reasons I like this statement is that it disassociates the function of public relations from an organization, right? So any particular kind of organizations. I mean, we all agree, and we've studied public relations practice in different kinds of organizations, that grassroots activist organizations practice public relations, civil society groups, NGOs, as well as major corporations practice public relations. So it positions the function of communication as having the ability to contribute to producing the conditions of civil society, regardless of the kind of organization and for different motivations. So I see definitely where you're coming from, Anna, but if we can extrapolate and disassociate the function of public relations from the kind of organization that it serves, we're then able to intellectually and more heuristically approach this concept for civil society and social capital research.
But then we need to say that if we dissociate this function, and if we apply to this premise, it seems like we are thinking of this function in a very positive way, when it actually can be quite negative. Well, for example, there can be very strategic communication and very much public relations efforts to break the civil society, you know, to marginalize people, or you know, to encourage, I don't know, like to build distrust actually in the society, in the community. So I guess I don't want to be overly positive of that function, because it actually also can be negative. So yeah, I don't have an answer for this. It's just thoughts out loud, I guess.
Well, one of the criticisms that I wrote about in the article that I shared, and Maureen is intimately familiar with this criticism, is that civil society is a Western phenomenon that is a guise for imperialism and coming to, you know, the Western domination over subaltern publics, and in places where publics cannot resist Western capitalistic forces. And that civil society, you know, and our classical notions of civil society is group-based, individualistic, approaches to communication does not apply many places in the world. So there is a critique inherent in that. However, in all these places, there's a serious lack of trust among individuals and serious lack of trust in institutions. So if we adopt the normative perspective of public relations as being able to rebuild trust in societies, then there is an avenue forward. I mean, Michael, Petra, and others have written about, and Anne have written about the dark side of dialogue in name only, for example, right? If, you know, pretending to engage in dialogue for malfeasant ends. So there's the same thing for, you know, public relations. So this is inherently a normative perspective we're talking about here, with the caveat, Anna, that definitely these things can be used for imperialistic and capitalistic ends. We've covered quite a bit about what makes a civil society civil in our discussions: tolerance for different opinions, you know, giving people a voice at the table. So the connection between civil society and social capital is that people feel that they actually can engage in conversation and build connections with other people to hopefully in the future take advantage of the resources they build for those connections. So from the Taylor article, why is tolerating different opinions necessary for a civil society? Michael, do you want to speak to this, even though you're sitting next to Dr. Taylor?
Well, that's fair.
I know you're famous for tolerating different opinions.
Fame. But can I actually say something, though? That was 10 years ago. I actually have a different view about the word tolerate.
Okay, please do.
Tolerate is something that is from the powerful to the powerless, right? So I tolerate you. I mean, I sort of accept you. So I probably would use a different term now, because I think I have unpacked some of the baggage of the term toleration.
But people at the bottom have to tolerate people at the top. So it works both directions. When you don't have power, you have to tolerate those who are in power.
Mm-hmm. So I would rethink that verb right now.
I think that's very interesting. And yeah, tolerating seems to be a loaded term these days, but how would engaging with others of different opinions necessary for a civil society then?
Mm-hmm. Engaging or facilitating, but definitely not tolerating anymore.
No. So I mean, you know, refusing to communicate with people just because they have a different point of view from you is not a civil society, yes?
No.
Right. So if we are unwilling to change, if we are unwilling to build relationships with people who are unlike us, right, we're never going to gain information from them. We're never going to be able to utilize them as a potential source of social capital in the future, right? So this is how social capital and civil society are aligned. That societies are stronger, right, if they have a greater engagement among, and perhaps I'm struggling for a synonym for tolerance right now, willingness to engage with others and hear the opinions of others. So she also speaks to us about public relations' role in co-creating meaning and facilitating the co-construction of meaning between different parties as a condition for civil society. And so what role does shared meaning creation have in social capital? Alvin, what do you think?
I think the social capital creation is the consequence and the results of shared meaning. And through communication, people create shared meaning through their communication. And thus they build relationships that contribute to social capital at large.
We don't have shared understandings or shared norms about how something should work. It's going to be very difficult for us to engage in a mutually reciprocal relationships. And finally, she says that groups must feel safe to create discourses that attempt to influence the public sphere of discussion. In many places, there's just not enough social capital, there's not enough social trust for groups to engage in conversations, for a group to reach out to build networks of support from other people. So that speaks to a lack of civil society, that speaks to a lack of social capital, right? So social capital can be the outcome of organizational relationships in civil society when organizations work to build that trust that facilitates conversation, that facilitates meaning making and shared opinion dissemination. So I want to talk very briefly about the Sommerfeldt and Taylor article, which really focuses on network approaches to understanding social capital and public relations. We've talked considerably about perceiving organizational relationships as social capital. We've talked about different kinds of network arrangements that facilitate social capital, but we've yet to connect this notion of boundary spanning to social capital. What is a traditional notion of public relations boundary spanner? What do they do?
Boundary spanners are people who have connections outside of the organization. So, and sometimes within the organization, but to different departments and that sort of thing. So most people have ties just to the group they work with, but boundary spanners go beyond that.
Yes. And the idea of boundary spanning in public relations actually takes its inspiration from systems theory. We position an organization as a system within a larger ecological environment. And a cell exists in its environment, but it requires, things that go in and out of it. So public relations is the boundary spanner, that information comes in and information goes out through those boundary spanners. So it's the facilitator of an organization's relationship, maintaining that homeostasis that the organization has with its environment, right? We want to make sure that it can survive and thrive within its environment, right? So we have to maintain trust and support within an organization and without. One of the main premises, I think, what this article was so interesting that Maureen and I wrote, was that the internal position of public relations within an organization actually affected its ability to influence external capital. Do we agree with that assertion that we made in the article, that a lack of internal social capital for a public relations department resulted in its inability to cultivate external or societal social capital? Or we're just on a fool's errand with that argument?
Maureen says no.
Maureen says no. Maureen says that was actually one of the most important observations I've ever made in my research. You and me, Eric, really, because
and she's very humble.
No, not because it's important, but because it's an important observation for us who study the public relations function. When you have a diminished or a powerless public relations function inside the organization's relationships with publics will suffer, because you don't have the boundary spanning function. You don't have a way of creating the conditions or participating in the conditions that help to create civil society. So that, for me, that was like really, this is why networks are so important. It was a really interesting study, because what I was told, and then what the data, what we were told and the data came back as, really did confirm that without a central and at least influential public relations function, an organization will not engage with its publics, and then civil society is diminished.
So it requires organizations who want to build civil society to have trusted, efficient communication mechanisms by which to engage in relationship building. And that was not present in this organization that we studied, right? It had no avenue by which to engage in external social capital and trust building, right? So that was pretty much a wash for that organization. All right, this is a good, really stimulating, I love bringing up this question in my classes. Do you think most people can be trusted? This is a question from the World Values Survey that is administered every couple of years by the University of Michigan. Mm-hmm. And what can we learn from this question? And newsflash, it's a lot. Do you think most people can be trusted? And what can we learn from the answer to that question?
No.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, that's how the question is posed by the World Values Survey, as a yes or no answer. Petra, you got off mute, so I know you wanted to talk about this.
Oh, yeah. No, I don't really. I just want to say, I think yes. I think it's easy to say no, Michael. But actually, if you think about it, whenever you go outside, whenever you go on public transport or you walk in the city, etc., if we didn't trust people to do the basic right thing, that means you pretty much leave yourself open for all sorts of things to happen. So I think the default position should be that generally we can trust people. Doesn't mean we can trust everyone, and we can't trust everyone all the time. But my personal view is yeah, you should err on the side of trust as much as possible.
Okay, Kim, do you want to respond?
I was just going to say that I think there are trustworthy people and there are people that you don't trust, and I think you make a choice about whether or not you want to have them in your network and what value and purpose they serve, both to you individually and to your network. But I think that the generalization that all people can be trusted and all people can't be trusted is really not appropriate, because it depends on who the person is. And yourself, there are people that you would never trust, but you choose to have them in your network for an outcome or for the value that they bring.
So these are two different perspectives on this question, which I think are really interesting. That, Petra spoke to this notion of generalized social trust, like you go out of your house and you just expect that people are going to behave in a certain way, right? You trust that they're going to behave in a certain way, otherwise things are going to fall apart, right? And then Kim, you talked about trust in your interpersonal relationships, right? That you have a trust in only a certain number of individuals, right? So if we only have a trust in a certain number of individuals, perhaps that implies a distrust of just the average person you're going to meet on the street, right? And if we can't trust the average person we meet on the street, that can translate to a distrust in institutions, a distrust in media, a distrust in governments, right? This one little question: do you think most people can be trusted, right? Not just your intimate contacts, but do you think most people can be trusted? Really is a strong predictor of your trust in governments, institutions, media, and everything that tends to hold society together. Do you want to go back, Kim?
I think it depends. So can most people be trusted? So you're walking down the street. Can most people that you pass in the street be trusted not to hurt you or not to kill you? Yes, because we have institutional laws. But look at what's happening over in Minnesota at the moment. Without the police presence and because of those triggers, there are things happening. There's social unrest because of that situation. So I think it depends on what the nature of your relationship is with those people. So yes, I can, my community, I trust that most people are law-abiding. I trust that most people will do the right thing to a certain extent. But then, you then put particular contexts or pressures on that relationship, and it depends.
Yeah. So I think that your approach to this is very nuanced and appropriate, and I do think it's very context specific. In the social capital literature, it has drawn a lot on this particular question, and how many people answer yes or no is that strong predictor of whether or not people believe in things like the police and how much the police can be trusted, whether or not people are going to go out rioting in the street. So is it contextual? I think absolutely, and they've phrased this question as a binary, but it has time and time again been shown to be intimately connected with broader variables about trust in national institutions, media, etc. So in this 2013 article, I focus a lot on the role of generalized versus particularized trust. Do we have a general trust in everyone in society, or we only have trust in particular individuals? So one of the things that Maureen and I wrote about is that the level of generalized trust in Jordan is very, very low, right? They're not likely to trust anybody who's different from themselves. They're only likely to trust people in their intimate social circles, people from their same religious background, from their same town, their same neighborhood, right? So that can contribute to an inability to organizations building broader trust and building social capital in broader communities. Michael, you had your hand up?
Oh, Shima was trying to get in earlier. I'm not sure if you got her on your video.
Hi, Shima, please, yes.
You gotta unmute it.
Yeah.
I just wanted to answer to the last question, but
if you'd like to come back to it, please do.
about whether we can trust most of people in society or not. I just wanted to answer it that it depends. Actually, it is answered in this slide. It depends in which society we are living. If we are living in a society where people have a high sense of community, people think that they belong to one community, then yes, we can trust most people. But if we are living in a fractured community where people are part of their own groups and they feel that they are separate from each other, pursuing their own goals, then no, we cannot trust most people in society.
Yeah, that was a beautiful transition, Shima, to this slide, which presents the data from the World Values Survey about how many people, the percentage of people who say most people can be trusted, right? And so we see very clearly some of the most distrusting places in the world and some of the most trusting places in the world. So you guys in Australia and New Zealand should count yourself lucky to be highly trusting spaces. And we see Scandinavia as being highly trusting. And interestingly, China is a space in which people are highly trusted, right? And China is an anomaly, really, because we view this trust measure as highly correlated with perceptions of corruption as well. So we see views of the most and least trusting countries. So top most trusting countries, think places like the Netherlands, China, Sweden, New Zealand, Australia, and the least trusting countries, Philippines, Colombia, Brazil, Peru. And these metrics are typically correlated with perceptions of corruption, where we believe the media is corrupt, the government is corrupt, institutions are corrupt. Mm-hmm. But China is sort of an anomaly where most people trust each other.
China has really high levels of trust in the government too, in particular, which I think skews some of that. Because we talk about this in my class, and we look at trust, and the U.S. and some more places have really low levels of trust in business and low levels of trust in the government. And China has this really high level of trust in the government and consequently higher levels of trust in business.
Yeah. So we see some places where the highest levels of production are strongly correlated with the levels of trust. Anna, you had your hand up?
Yes, I wanted to add a few things kind of thinking about this, because I think trust can be very different. And when you just ask, do you think most people can be trusted? I immediately not sure what kind of trust do you mean, because yes, from one point of view, I can, because when you say, can you trust people? Like I think about, can I loan them money, or can I give them to take, can I allow them to take care of my kids, or can I rely on them in some way? So, but when you ask, but when you ask us, can people can be trusted in a general sense? Like I'm not sure about this. Like I wonder if when we break the trust, if when you break the trust into different types of trust, I think that the picture is going to be very different. And maybe in China, I don't know, like I haven't seen the data or anything, but it may also be because of the crime rates and things you see that's happening around you. So it's I don't want to link it only to the government and to their expectations kind of you have from people who are not close to you. But like, there are different types of trust, I guess. That's what I'm trying to make.
So we trust is a multifaceted concept for sure. And the World Values Survey question is limited in that it's only a yes or no question. But I'm more interested in the notion of generalized versus particularized trust and its implications for civil society and social capital building, right? If I only have trust in my intimate contacts, my family members, my neighbors, whatever, that's going to limit my ability to engage in conversation with people who are unlike me, take advantage of those resources that I might build from that, get new and novel information, right? Whereas if I'm only likely to trust in my in-group, right, it's going to be a very different existence. And I'm going to be very distrustful of people who are unlike me. That does not lend itself to our traditional Western notions of civil society, right? So, and that has its fair number of critics about how we view civil society and social capital. But without a trust in others, it limits the ability of associational life to come together and resist external forces and put back on the state. So there is some merit in the argument that public relations as enacted by civil society groups, activist groups, and yes, even corporations should work to build that generalized trust so that civil society, so that marginalized groups can form that associational life to push back on external forces and make their views known to government. And it's the lack of that trust, as social capital theorists would say, it's the lack of that trust that prevents them from doing so. So that's what it speaks to in the Sommerfeldt article, which I'm going to go a bit more quickly here so we can wrap up in the next 15 minutes or so. Thinking about the relationship between civil society and the public sphere, that if we don't have representation in the public sphere as enabled by civil society, groups can't push back against the state. They can't make their views known. So without that generalized trust, we have a really hard time enacting what we might call a Western civil society, and that's how it's been portrayed much then in the literature. So we really associate strong high levels of social capital with higher levels of democracy. So does social capital precede civil society, trust, and democracy? Or where does it exist in that sort of relationship? Maureen, what do you think?
Sorry, the person who's managing my my computer. I think it's both. I think it's an outcome, and I think it's an input as well. So more social capital begets more social capital, and civil society begets more social capital and trust, and then it's sort of an iterative process.
Yeah, it's what Putnam called a virtuous cycle.
Virtuous
right?
cycle. There you go.
Yeah.
Yep.
Trust begets more trust, so more social capital begets more social capital, which once again, frustratingly, surprise, surprise, just speaks to the vagueness of its operationalization and how the hell are we supposed to measure it, right? Let alone try to position it in a traditional quantitative study, right? This is not a concept that's very easily operationalized. And, you know, I will say that I've tried operationalizing in many a network study, right? And there, you know, there's limitations to doing so, right? So as I will argue later, it's better viewed as a context and a juxtaposition in which public relations efforts are analyzed and studied, as and less so as a research instrument, I would say.
Well, in the relationship building model, though, risk precedes trust. You know, so before you can have trust, you need to risk and try trusting. And then you need reciprocity from the other person. So I don't know if that is worth noting, but you actually, trust needs to be preceded by trust on one party's part, which is risk.
Yeah. Well, and as you have written in dialogue, that any relationship worth having is risky, right? So any relationship that's going to yield resources for you or build social capital is going to be inherently risky, right? And that's why we invest time and energy in maintaining that relationship. But I guess, weak ties, Michael, say that we don't have to maintain a whole lot of energy and time in maintaining those weak ties, but then we can actually, it's still a social capital resource for us, but weak ties are probably less risky for us. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, so by definition, but if I want to move a weak tie to a strong tie, I have to make that, if we think of it, again, the relationship building model, I have to devote more attention to those people. I have to interact with them more. I have to, you know, I have to put myself out there, and then they have to want to, right? So there are, you know, I remember one of my first days at OU, early on, I decided I was going to build some relationships with all my colleagues. And I invited Jim Avery out to lunch, and we had lunch, and I said, oh, we should do this again. And Jim's like, whoa, 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 you know, let's not get carried away. You know, we had lunch once. I don't think we should have lunch every day, you know, so that's how it works.
And isn't that got a little bit to do with reciprocity styles? That not everyone reciprocates in the same way. So there's a risk around whether or not they reciprocate, but also that the nature of that reciprocation.
Yeah.
The nature of the reciprocation and the resource we hope to gain from that relationship, right? So, or the resource that can be leveraged from that relationship. So, you know, for Jim Avery, he was looking at your relationship hopefully more as a weak tie than as a strong tie, perhaps. So he made that contact, didn't require a whole lot of time and energy. So he's like, I don't want Michael Kent as a strong tie, but he'll be good to have as a weak tie if I ever need him for something, you know. So this comes back full circle to this notion of the creation and maintenance of organizational social capital as the underlying theory and practice of public relations. It's something I've written about, something that Oyvind Eklund has written about, something that Maureen and others have written about, and something that Vilma Luoma-aho has written about. She wrote this great chapter really in detail, emphasizing the contribution of Robert Putnam's theory of social capital to public relations. We've talked about how learning to trust at a small scale can translate to trust at a social scale, right? If I can learn to trust people, I can learn to trust media, I can learn to trust institutions and government, right? The truth, however, might be more complicated. The direction of causality is a bit murky. We like to make these assumptions about, hey, if I can build interpersonal trust, I can build, institutional trust. We're not quite sure on the causality of that, but that's the normative theory that we're working from here, and that's the heuristic value of social capital for public relations. So Vilma and I and other people have really tried to position public relations, reposition public relations for social capital building as community relations. Rebuilding that sense of community that Petra talked about is really vital to enhancing the social capital of a community that I feel like I can draw upon. I live in a civil society. I live in a place with high social capital. I know that there is support there should I need it. Why are some nations faring better than others during this pandemic outbreak is, the notion that the resources are out there, the healthcare is out there, the ability for them to cope beyond this crisis is out there. It's not even needing perhaps those resources, but knowing that you could take advantage of them should you need them. So we see a lot of complementary frameworks in public relations that can be applied in the study of social capital, things like dialogue. We've got experts in engagement here. There are intimate connections between the social capital literature and engagement. For sure, the community building approaches that were advocated in the 80s by Dean Krukeberg and Stark, and they've written by Chiara Valentini and Caterina Tsatsura and other people about community building. These are very much complementary theories, as well as Homo Narens approaches to understanding how publics form and create shared opinions. Research on corporate social responsibility and advocacy and activist issues management are all areas in which that complement social capital research. So where are we going to go forward with social capital research, if at all? We need to be better about connecting our public relations initiatives to social capital outcomes and processes, right? What actual practices yield social capital outcomes? I think we also have potential in a closer alignment with development communication literature, which has much more thoroughly considered social capital in communities than we have. Looking at network building activities in communities, how we establish and build network ties in communities to support individuals and institutions. The facilitative or destructive role in building social capital. 15 years ago, everybody thought the internet was going to be, this utopia of dialogue and this new way for people to engage in, discourse, a rational critical discourse, and a new Habermasian public sphere was going to take place. But now we're pretty sure that social media can actually have a disconnecting role as well as a connecting role. So how much does it actually bring people together, whereas tearing people apart? And I've mentioned several times, I think that social capital is probably best used as a context or a juxtaposition rather than as an instrument in quantitative or qualitative studies. So practically, what does all this literature say for us? Build positive relationships, right? That's been a flagship, standard thing for public relations. Yeah, build positive relationships. It's connected to organizational social capital. Add value and help others. If the organization is perceived as a giver, others in the community are more likely to reciprocate. And reciprocity is a foundation of social capital. Help other people to connect. Organizations are very often in positions where they recognize in their different constituencies, their different publics, whom would benefit by being brought together. So utilize that organizational brokerage ability, because we're often in a situation where we've got better access to information and resources than others. Collaborate, building a foundation of trust, right? how individuals behave in organizations and reaching out is often more important than how institutions and organizations behave. So it starts with individual level. And never take advantage of others, right? Thinking long-term rather than short-term. How pie in the sky is all of this? Probably pretty pie in the sky. We've written a lot about pie in the sky stuff in public relations. So I think it's aspirational, it's normative, and it's a beautiful heuristic. And what's a heuristic? What's something when it has heuristic value?
I'm gonna make people look it up.
And Anna, you said something, you gestured, which I think speaks to it.
Yeah, like developing ideas, growing.
Yeah, the idea's got legs. Social capital has got legs for public relations, right? It's one of those ideas that can help move us forward, and it can generate a lot of new thinking and new studies. So this is something that I believe is an upcoming framework, and it can be utilized through various different methods. Network studies has been the predominant approach so far. And as my voice is coming apart, I will say, just to conclude, that success is not solitary. It's a product of our relationships and the resources we leverage and invoke in those relationships. And that's what social capital is all about. So this is me. I know a lot of you, but I would love to hear from you in the future and collaborate. And thank you very much.
All right, good job.
Thank you.
Bravo.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any last things we want to talk about?
Eric.
Thank you, Kim. I don't know how you close things out, but I'm happy to talk about any last few things.
Yeah, usually we say we're ending it. We would give people a chance to talk if they want to, and then people start disappearing and hanging up, and eventually we end it.
Well, okay, I'll officially say the lecture is over, but I would be happy to hang around and chit chat for a minute if everybody would like to. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
We appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Eric, may I ask a question?
Please.
I was just thinking that how does social capital interrelate with other capitals in a sense that I guess what I'm curious about is the role of power. It seems like the powerful ones don't need as much networks and relationships as less powerful ones. So kind of less powerful ones, they're building those relationships to gain the power. But if you already have good connections in the government and have a lot of money and, you know, kind of well off in general, you are less interested in this. So I guess I'm just curious how all those different capitals, they interrelate and interplay in the society in general.
I mean, what you're talking about is very much what Pierre Bordeaux wrote about in his view as social capital, and that how do people in power maintain their power by being in relationships with other powerful people, right? And you have access to resources that you should need, and you're all working together to maintain your elite status and power, right? Even people in powerful positions need other people to support them, right? So they recognize if they want to continue their position, that exclusivity and access, right? They must utilize that network. What are country clubs all about? What are, oligarchic societies all about, right? So I don't think that they need social capital any less. They just build different kinds of networks for different purposes, right? Than a very Putnam kind of view on, and how we get ahead in life, right? So these people are already ahead, but I've got to maintain these networks if I want to stay ahead.
Thank you.
You bet. All right, if there's no other questions, I'll let you guys go, so I've kept you long enough, but thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Petra. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Shima. Thank you, Michael. Take care.
Should I stay? You're on mute.
You can't read lips? Can we take a quick break? I haven't eaten yet.
Sure. Would you like to talk tomorrow? Because I think in your email you said Saturday, but by mistake I said on Friday.
Whatever works. Let me look real quick, just a second. I think Saturday is open. I don't think I have anything going on today, tomorrow. It's up to you. I can talk Saturday. I have nothing scheduled for Saturday. You want to talk tomorrow?
Yes.
Okay. Then let's plan on talking tomorrow, like at 10 or 12. What do you want to do? 10?
Okay, 10.
Okay. I'll send it in a minute.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay. See you later.
See you.